Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. This video is a follow-up to an earlier video which was comparing knights and bishops. And I'm sure we touched on what I'm going to talk about in this video and the other video, but now we're going to do it in a little more detail. So what we're going to talk about today is why knights before bishops. I think most people, when they first start playing chess, at some point they hear the famous principle, knights before bishops, meaning in the opening, develop knights before you develop bishops. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about all aspects of that. We're going to talk about when you do it, how you interpret it, give some examples, that kind of thing. I think the biggest issue, and the one that's the least discussed, is does knights before bishops mean knight, knight, bishop, bishop? Or does it mean knight, bishop, knight, bishop? Because in both cases, the knights are before the bishops. In the first case, knight, knight, bishop, bishop, you bring out both knights before both bishops. In the second case, knight, bishop, you bring out a knight before a bishop, let's say on each side of the board, knights before bishops, but not necessarily both knights before both bishops. That's rarely discussed when people just say knights before bishops. Now, before we talk about that issue further, I must add, if you know what the book moves are in your opening, then principles don't apply. If your opening says, let's say you're playing the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, and in the exchange variation, it says play, bishop d3, and if they play knight f6, quick grab that diagonal with bishop f4. Here's a case, admittedly a little bit rare, where you get both knights before both bishops. So if these are the book moves for the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, and you learn these moves, then you don't care about what the principle says. Let's say you run out of your book at this point. Well, you don't need to know the principle knights before bishops because you've already known that the book moves are to bring out the two bishops first. And you're not violating any principles as long as you're following book moves. Principles are for when you don't know what to do. So if you get out of your book, let's say you go to play the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann and you play pawn takes pawn, and black says, I'm going to sack that pawn and play knight f6. And you say, all right, I'll grab the pawn, pawn takes, knight takes. Well, now you're out of your book, and now you would have to use the idea of maybe knights before bishops if it applies here. Notice, ironically, in this position, black certainly used that idea, and he's used both knights before both bishops. Okay, so we're talking about, is it usually NNBB or is it NBNB? Well, the right answer to that is, if you're not sure, it's usually NBNB rather than NNBB. And when I ask people, why is it more likely NBNB than NNBB, most of them get the right answer, which is because you need to castle as soon as possible. So if we take a common opening like the Ruy Lopez, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, the most common moves here are to bring the bishop out. Bishop to b5 is the Ruy Lopez, NB. Bishop to c4 is the Italian game. Much more common than knight to c3, which is could lead to either the four knights game or the three knights game, or maybe transpose into a Scotch. But in any case, much more common right now at the Grandmaster level, bishop c4 is made a comeback thanks to the engines, but bishop to b5 traditionally has been the number one move, the Ruy Lopez, and here we see NB. Why? Well, in the main line again, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, white plays castles. And that's the move he's trying to play. He's trying to castle as soon as possible. So this is a superb example of NB and then castle for white. Notice for black, his book moves are NN. So he's going to end up being NNBB while white's going NBNB. So it's not that uncommon to be NNBB, and it's not that uncommon to be NBNB. And of course, as we saw in the exchange Caro-Kann, there's some book lines where the bishops come out first. That's just the way it goes for book lines, because book lines, as I said, don't follow principles. Okay, so we've got NBNB as maybe slightly more common than NNBB, and that's why you do it. Now let's talk about why we bring out knights first. And there's two big reasons for that. All right, so the first reason is, let's talk about the speed of the pieces. I always tell people, let's say you're back in World War II and you're coordinating D-Day, and you've got planes and ships that have to go over to Normandy, and you know your Air Force isn't so strong enough that it's going to go over there and fight by itself and weaken, the German lines and give away the fact that that's where you were attacking. You want it to be a big surprise that everybody shows up. Well, who do you send out first? You send out the boats first because they're slower, and as they get near Normandy, then you send out the planes who can quickly catch up and all get there at the same time. You're coordinating your attack with your knights and your planes. In order to coordinate an attack at a distance, you need to send out the slower vehicles first. Chess is exactly the same. If you're going to attack your opponent on his side of the board, bishops can get from the first rank to the 8th rank in either 1 or 2 moves when the board is empty. Let's empty out the board and show you. Let's put a bishop over here. He can get to the 8th rank in 2 moves. Let's say bishop c4, bishop g8. But notice that means he can also attack the 8th rank in 1 move. Suppose black castles his king over to this square. You can check him in 1 move with your bishop, even from his starting square. So the bishops are very fast. They can go all across the board in 1 move. I can even go from the 1st rank to the 8th rank if I'm on h1 or a1. I can go all the way to the other side of the board in 1 move. So bishops are fast compared to pawns or knights or kings, which can't move all the way across the board. We think of the queens, the rooks, and the bishops as the fast pieces. But the fast pieces can attack the whole board, or I shouldn't say the whole board, but can attack the other side of the board relatively instantaneously from almost everywhere, assuming they have the right open lines. So they don't need to be very close to the target. Kings and pawns and knights have to be relatively close to the target. If I have a knight on its original square, let's put a knight on g1. We'll take the bishop and the king off the board. My knight needs 4 moves to get to the other side of the board. And it needs, if there's a king on the 8th rank, let's put the king back on g8. If I want to check the king, it's going to take me a few moves here. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 4, or something like that. 4 moves to check the king. Well, let's say I just want to guard a square where a queen can checkmate him. Let's say I need my knight to help me checkmate on, well, let's put the king somewhere where I can do it in 1 less move. King h8. If I want to checkmate the king on h8, I need at least 2 knight moves to help the queen. I have to play knight h3, and then I have to play knight g5, and now I'm threatening to play queen h7 mate. But I can't do it in 1 move like the bishop or the rook could do. The knight needs time to affect these squares. The fact that I can affect him in only 2 moves and guard the mating square is pretty good. Normally it's going to take 3 or 4 or more. Alright, so also knights are path pieces. If the bishop can kind of get an open diagonal and he's great, a knight needs more than just 1 open line. He needs a whole bunch of open squares that he can pop around. If I start putting pawns on squares where the knight can get to, it's going to be a lot harder to get the knight around because his path is blocked. Is it easier to block a bishop's path because you can block it at any point? Yes, but it might be blocked further away, or you can maneuver to an open line, and a knight doesn't have as much mobility, so it's hard for him to do that kind of maneuvering to get there. All right, so even though knights can jump over pieces, if we have a crowded board, then the knight's going to actually do better than the bishop. But normally the bishop's going to be able to get over there quicker. If I have the bishop on f1 again, I can just go to d3 and already I'm guarding that h7 square. So bishops are faster. So that's one reason why you bring out your knights first. It's the D-Day attack thing. If I want to coordinate an attack on the other side of the board, if my opponent has a lot of his pieces over here and I need to get pieces up there to help out, then the bishop's going to be able to get there really quickly, but the knight's going to take more time to coordinate to get up there to help. So we want to do knights before bishops. All right, is that the only reason we want to do knights before bishops? No. There's another reason, and it's just as important. Let's go back to the initial position. Okay, because bishops are faster and they can move all the way across the board, their potential mobility, which is how far they can move when the board is empty, and we talked about this in the previous video, knights and bishops, is much greater than the knights. So here, let's say the e-pawn has moved in the game, and later on we're going to move the g-pawn. Now normally you don't move both those pawns because you can only move the bishop one way or the other, and it's a waste of a tempo to do this. And it also weakens your white squares. But let's say this has happened. In this position, the bishop has 7 moves that it can make. And we could argue, especially if we don't know what black's doing, if we just take all the pieces off the board again, and we put the bishop over here and we see these 7 moves, we could argue that with enough information, any one of those 7 squares might be the best one. For instance, let's say black has castled queenside, and let's say, well, let's see here. What's the best way to do this? Well, let's say the king has moved over to b8, and black has pawns, you know, here, here. Whoops. Trying to set something up here, but I'm not doing a very good job. Alright, well, what I'm trying to do is set up a position where, you know, I've got kind of a crisscross on his pieces, like this. And in this kind of position, maybe bishop a6 is the best move. Looks like checkmate here, right? Alright, same thing with bishop h3. I could probably set up a checkmate there. That would be a little more difficult. And maybe bishop h3 is just good because I could pin the, you know, let's put a knight over here to guard the bishop. And let's put a queen over here. And then we say, oh good, he's castled queenside with his queen on d7. Bishop h3, I'll pin the queen to the king. Now, admittedly, this is a little far-fetched. But my point remains, which is when you have the board empty, depending on what your opponent is doing, you might want to fianchetto the bishop on g2. In some rare lines, the bishop goes here. There's a lot of lines where the bishop goes to e2. There's even more lines where the bishop goes to c3. The bishop on c4 is a popular move. We just looked at the Italian game where you're attacking that weak f7 square and the square the black king is going to castle. Bishop b5, popular. Roy Lopez puts the bishop on the line where the king starts the game. And we just saw a line where bishop a6 is checkmate. So any of those squares might be the best square. It's very unlikely bishop a6 is going to be the best square on the first move of the game, or on your first move for the bishop in the game, because early in the game there's a knight on b8 that guards that square. There's a pawn on b7 that guards that square, so it's not going to be safe to go to a6. But if black starts moving his pieces, let's say he plays knight c6, let's make a black's move here, and then later he goes to fianchetto his bishop by moving it out, and then he trades off his bishop, you know, maybe the bishop can come up to a6. But again, the point is, we don't really know where the bishop's best square is very much. We could take a guess. We can decide we're going to play a Roy Lopez and put it out to b5 right away. We could decide to play a Benko opening and play g3 and bishop g2 right away. Nothing wrong with those ideas, but the bishop does have a lot of squares that could be better than others depending on what your opponent is doing. And chess is a game of information, and if you get the information on what he does, it helps you figure out where the bishop goes. On the other hand, and we looked at this in the other video, I'm sure, let's look at the knight's first move of the game. The knight's first move of the game, if he goes to e2, let's say, he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares he can go to from e2. If he goes to h3, he only has 1, 2, 3, 4 squares he can go to. If he goes to f3, his potential mobility, that's what I call the number of squares you can go to when the board's empty, his potential mobility is 8. So we've got 8 versus 6 versus 4 over here. But if we actually put pieces on the board and we look at how it coordinates with the other pieces, if you play knight f3, you're blocking, let's just do some random move for black, a6. If you play knight f3 here, which is not the best move, it's better to play d4 if he plays f6. But if we play knight f3, we're blocking the f-pawn, but right now playing f4 is not necessarily a break move or anything like that. yes, that f-pawn can be a good pawn to move in the opening and in the middle game, but the fact that we want to bring out the knight and we're putting it on its best potential mobility square is okay. We're blocking the queen from going past the f3 square, but the queen doesn't want to move right away anyway. The queen can later go to e2, or he can go to another square. Let's say later we move the d pawn to let the queen come out. So the blocking of the queen's not a big deal, and we're not blocking anything besides the f-pawn and the queen. So the knight going to f3 in this kind of position is not that discoordinating. We're blocking the queen a little bit, we're blocking the pawn, everything else is happy. The rook's happy, the knight's out of the way, the bishop's happy he didn't block it, the king's happy, he's guarding the squares around the king. So knight f3 is a pretty good coordinating move. Knight h3, well, that doesn't block the queen at all, so that's better. It doesn't block the bishop, it doesn't block the rook, that's nice. But the knight on h3 doesn't have as much control of the center. In fact, it has much less control of the center. If we're on f3, we're guarding two of the central squares. And not only do we have the 8 squares of potential mobility, but we're guarding 2 central squares. Here we're guarding no central squares. The only square near the center that we're guarding is f4, which is not as important as the d4, e4, d5, e5 idea. So the knight on h3 needs another move to really get that central influence. We have the famous knight on the rim, your future is grim or dim, and that's because it has less mobility there. And also there's lines where this bishop can capture that knight, and if you have to take with a pawn, it might open up your king if you're castle kingside. So we've got some problems with knight h3, where the coordination isn't that bad, but the potential mobility and center control are pretty weak. Knight e2 does guard a central square, and it has 6 potential moves, but it has tremendous discoordination with the queen and the bishop. It blocks the queen completely, it blocks the bishop completely. So now if we want to get the bishop out without moving the knight, we're going to have to do something like fianchetto the bishop with g3, or we have to move the knight again. Maybe later on we'll do something like knight to g3, but that takes 2 tempos instead of 1, and the longer it takes for you to develop your entire army, the more likely your opponent is doing it, and you fall behind in development, and the person who's behind in development has less activity and usually doesn't have the initiative, and the other person gets the advantage in the attack first if you waste time moving pieces multiple times like that unnecessarily. So putting the knight on e2 is theoretically less desirable than putting it on f3. What does all this add up to? Well, knight f3 gives you more center control, it gives you more potential mobility, and it gives you better piece coordination than knight e2. Maybe not quite as good as knight h3, but it kills knight h3 on all the other issues. So knight f3 is the theoretically best square. But bishops don't have that. Bishops have some squares that are slightly better than others, but with the bishops it changes tremendously based on what you're doing with the other pieces and what your opponent's doing with his pieces. With a knight it doesn't vary quite as much. It varies, yes, of course, but it doesn't vary quite as much. So we have squares like knight f3 that we're pretty sure we want the knight to go to, but we're not quite as sure with the bishop. We'd like to see what the opponent's doing to give us an idea where the bishop's going to be the most effective. So that's a good reason to bring out knights before bishops. It's not just the first reason that we talked about because it's slower, but it's also because it gives you more time to figure out what the opponent's doing, so you figure out where to put the bishop, because the bishop has more squares where that square might be the right square. For instance, suppose you play knight f3 and your opponent keeps doing silly things and you say, all right, I'll grab the center. And now he plays, I don't know, let's say he plays g6. Well, that might tell you that here, if he's going to play g6 in fianchetto, maybe the bishop on d3 supporting this diagonal isn't quite as good as maybe going to this diagonal and attacking the f7 square. Maybe that's not true here, or maybe it is, but that's the kind of information that you're looking for. You're looking for where he's putting his pieces so you can figure out where you want to put yours. And that's extremely helpful. So knights before bishops comes from several issues, and the 2 biggest issues are you have a better idea where the knights are probably going to be the strongest more quickly than you do with the bishops, and also the knights are the slower piece. So knights before bishops. For the last part of the video, I thought we'd take some famous, well-known, well-played openings and see how that knights before bishop goes. All right, so we looked at a little bit at the Roy Lopez. Let's look at the Italian game. Knight f3, knight before bishop, and now which one do we bring out first in the Italian game? There we have white going NB. Now black's already gone N. Which one does he do next? Well, if he plays the Gioco piano, it's going to be a B. By the way, I should mention that if you can, you should do what white's doing here, which is develop the pieces on the side you're going to castle first. That goes along with the NBNB idea. And here, the Italian game is exactly that. Now you might say, but black's not going to castle queenside. Why did he bring out the queen knight first? Well, black is reacting to what white's doing. White's attacking his pawn, and he wants to save the pawn and develop a piece. Well, he could play the Petrov's defense and counterattack and do bring out the knight on the side, king side, where he's probably going to castle. But the more common move and the more natural move is to develop the queen knight first. So that's one of the reasons why black has a disadvantage in an opening in chess. Since he goes second, he has to react to white, and white is forcing him to move out the knight on the side where he's not going to castle probably first. So white's going to get a jump on black and castling here. This is very important kind of basic information. Okay, so black now could play Gioco piano and go knight NB, or he could play two knights defense and go NNBB and play knight to f6. So black might be NBNB, black might be NNBB in the Italian game. All right, so let's look at a different opening. Let's look at the Queen's Gambit. So the Queen's Gambit is not an opening where white normally develops the pieces on the side he's going to castle. This one goes against the rules, but again, against the principles. But the principles don't apply to book moves. So let's look at the main line of the Queen's Gambit. D4, D5, the break move C4. Now all of black's main moves here are pawn moves. If he does something like the famous inaccuracy knight f6, you should look this up on why this is bad. I see a lot of people who play Queen's Gambits for white and they don't know what to do when black does this. But you should look that up. I have another video called The Most Common Opening Inaccuracies. You could check that out. Or you can ask an engine. Anyway, e6 is the main move. Knight c3, knights before bishops, knight f6, knights before bishops. Bishop g5. Oh, now we know white's got an NB here going here. And black usually plays bishop e7. There's an NB for him. Now white needs to finish his development. Very often he plays like e3, castle. There's that NB allowing castle, just like we said. Knight f3. Well, now we know what white's going to be. He's going to be an NB-NB kind of guy because he's already got NB-N, and now he has to bring out this bishop at some point. And he's going to be NB-NB. And here, black often plays moves like knight bd7. And now we can see he's going to be an NB-NB also. Because he started NB, and now he's gone N. And now he's got to work on that last piece, that more difficult to develop queen-bishop in the Queen's Gambit. All right, let's take a different opening. Let's take the King's Indian. D4, knight f6. There's an N. C4, G6. Knight c3, there's an N, and there's a B. All right, so in the King's Indian, black is an NB. White plays e4, black plays d6. Now, a lot of grandmasters here play knight f3, and a lot of amateur players do too, and it's a perfectly good move. But the main move order, the more common move order at the grandmaster level, is actually to play bishop e2. It really doesn't matter a lot. It matters a little which one you bring out first. I mean, I've played the King's Indian most of my life. I know this stuff pretty well, and it's not a mistake for white to play knight f3. It's a very common move. But bishop e2 is supposed to be microscopically a little bit more accurate. If you ask the engine, I'm sure he's going to say it doesn't make any difference, or at least very, very little difference. So bishop e2, now we've got an NB for white and an NB for black. Black castles, white plays knight f3. Now we got the N again, so we got NBN, e5, castle, knight c6, there's that NBN, d5, knight back. So we can see in this one, both sides did NBN, NBN, and they're heading for the last B and B over here. All right, let's take a different opening. Let's take, I don't know, we did a Caro-Kann earlier. Let's do a French. E4, E6, D4, D5. Main way is to guard this pawn. Knight c3. Now black could play a B first. He could play the winnower. slightly more popular these days is to play the classical N first. And now white has two moves. He could play bishop to G5, which is NB, or he can play the E5 Steinitz line right away. So let's go to the classical bishop to G5. Okay, now black has a choice. He can play the McCutcheon, which is a fun opening, bishop B4, or he can play the classical bishop E7. Either way, it's NB again. White often plays E5 here, knight D7, bishop takes, queen takes, and now white usually plays F4, and black cannot play C5, the break move, because of knight to B5 threatening the fork and the check. So black either has to castle here or play A6. Let's say he plays A6. Then white usually plays knight here. So now again we have N, B, N. And now black can play his break move C5. And if white plays, I don't know, let's say he plays bishop to E2. He could also play queen D2 to castle queenside. Bishop E2. Now we've got NB, NB for white. And if black plays knight C6, we now have an N, B, N, and then this B will be the last. So we've got NB, NBs in this line also. All right, we got time for maybe one more opening. Let's look at, I don't know, everybody likes to play the London. London, D4, let's do the D5 London. Bishop, there is a bishop before knight. Does it violate the principle? No, of course not. Bishop F4 is the book move. In the London, could you play like a delayed London and play N first and then transpose to the London with bishop here and do NB instead of BN? And the answer is sure. You're going to get to the same position. So whether you're doing NB or BN, you're going to end up with the same thing. Let's say black plays E6, white plays E3. Black could play bishop D6 or bishop E7. Either one would be NB. Let's say, for the sake of argument, he plays bishop E7, and now white's worried that black's going to play knight H5 and win the bishop pair. So white plays H3. Let's say black breaks with C5. White holds the center with C3. And now let's say black castles. Well, white has a choice. He could bring his knight out here and go NB, NB here. Or he could go the opposite and play bishop D3. This violates the knights before bishop idea. But it does follow the other principle, which is develop the pieces on the side you're going to castle first. And here, white's going to castle kingside for sure in this kind of position. So knights before bishops would be one principle, and the other principle would be develop the pieces on the side you're going to castle first. Well, that's what we want to do. We want to castle. And castling's so important. If you ask me which principle is more important here, assuming you don't know what the book move is, I would say, oh, do the one where you want to castle. That's more important. So bishop D3, a lot of people are afraid that black will play C4 here, and they play bishop E2. C4 is not a good move. Again, if you go back to that video, the most common opening inaccuracies, this move takes the pressure off the center, and now white can play bishop C2. And later on, what white's going to do is he's going to castle. And then, when black's trying to break on the queen side, which is the only place he can break, white's going to break in the center with E4, threatening E5, and after something like pawn takes, knight takes, white's going to have a space advantage in the center, and all white's pieces are going to be pointing to the center and king side, and poor black's queenside play has not much of a target. There's no white king over there or anything, so this isn't very good. So that's just a little bit of an aside in that position, but bishop D3 going for castling would make sense going against the knights before bishops. Alright, hopefully you enjoyed today's video about knights before bishops. Hopefully you learned something about developing. And please tell people about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you liked the video, you can like it. And if you haven't subscribed, we're trying to hit for 5,000 subscribers. I need about 600 more. So please do that too. Thanks a lot. Bye.